Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be stepping away from the rush of the present moment, intentionally. This isn't one of those deep dives where we're chasing breaking news or, analyzing the immediate feedback loop of daily life.
Right.
The pace is different here. We're slowing way down,
Yeah.
taking a really vast observational step back.
Yeah.
And we're just going to study the staggering and I think really subtle power of time itself.
We've sort of set aside the usual frantic churn of data of immediate sources to focus on something much quieter. We're treating the long view as our source material today. Just a relaxed, reflective look at the nature of patience, I guess, and the inevitability of perspective.
And what happens when you just introduce that that meaningful temporal distance
Yeah.
Into any problem or any struggle or even any obsession?
Exactly.
And I want to set a mandate for our listeners right now, which is that this conversation is purely observational.
Yes. That's so important.
We are not interested in extracting productivity tips or self-improvement advice or, telling you how you should use this perspective.
No.
Our goal is much simpler, but maybe more profound. We just want to notice the patterns, to be the silent spectators watching how the years filter and organize reality without us having to force it.
Without us having to consciously intervene.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing these quiet systems that are already at work all around us.
Right.
These systems that are driven by accumulation and decay and persistence. We're looking at time not as this scarce resource that you have to manage, but as a neutral agent, just silently altering our perceptions, collapsing one set of values and building up another simply by passing.
Okay, so let's unpack that quiet process. We sort of distilled 3 central observable patterns about time's effect that really form the core theme of this long view. These are the phenomena we're going to explore in detail today, looking for the underlying mechanisms that really drive these shifts.
And those observations are, first, the mechanism by which urgency just fades with distance.
Right.
Second, the retrospective process, how effort gains meaning only in hindsight.
Yeah.
And third, how our core priorities shift so naturally over years rather than through, these intentional daily decisions we think we're making.
Let's start with urgency then, because it is probably the most immediate, the most visceral, and often agonizing feeling that we encounter day to day.
It really is. When you are inside a crisis or inside a critical deadline or just inside a demanding immediate moment, that emotional reality is magnified tenfold.
It feels like a physical heat, doesn't it?
Oh.
A compression of everything else around it.
A compression, yeah. But that's a great word for it. And it's more than just a cognitive feeling. It's intrinsically tied to our physiological stress response.
Right.
That sensory and emotional magnification is tied directly to the temporal proximity of the perceived threat or requirement. The closer you are to the deadline or the threat, the higher the physiological response.
So it's not just in your head. Your body is...
Your body is reacting. This is essentially the cognitive bias we know as hyperbolic discounting at work. The value of a reward or the pain of a failure, it increases disproportionately the closer it gets to now.
That's a crucial distinction, that it's not just about rewards.
Yeah.
We always hear about it in terms of, $100 today versus $110 tomorrow.
Exactly.
But it applies to pain and threats, too.
Yeah.
And that makes the current pain feel exponentially heavier than some theoretical future pain.
Absolutely. Think about the internal monologue you have during a major work screw-up.
Oh, yeah.
Or even a small, embarrassing social blunder that just replays on a loop in your head.
Ugh, yes. In that moment, the mistake feels seismically important. Your career, your reputation, your very sense of self seems to hinge on correcting this one thing right now.
The entire universe seems to compress into that single error.
It does. And that intense emotional reality, it feels entirely authentic when you're experiencing it.
Yeah.
But here's the core observation we need to focus on. Compare that panicked, almost nauseating feeling of a small mistake made yesterday or maybe last week versus recalling that exact same mistake from 5 or 10 years ago.
There's no comparison.
The gravitational pull of the moment it weakens as you move away from it.
Completely dissolves.
5 years later, you might only recall the general outline. You'll think, oh, yeah, that was a stressful quarter. But the specific granular panic, the stomach-churning anxiety that consumed 3 full nights of sleep,
it's utterly gone.
It's not just forgotten. It feels like it's been chemically neutralized by time.
That brings us right to the mechanism of fading. What separates an urgent event from one that is merely important?
Good question.
The answer is almost always temporal proximity. Importance can endure for decades, right? The importance of maintaining your health, for instance, that's constant.
Sure.
But urgency is tied exclusively to the present tense. It is, by its very definition, an ephemeral state.
And that's where the dynamic gets so interesting, because importance is often stable. Like you said, if you have a critical long-term project, its importance is constant. But the urgency only spikes when the deadline is right here, right now.
Exactly. We can almost define urgency as importance multiplied by immediacy.
Oh, that's a great formula.
So you remove that factor of immediacy and the pressure system just collapses. It leaves behind only the importance, which without that temporal heat is often much, much less stressful.
Right.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, temporal distance provides that necessary context and scale.
Right.
A situation that felt like, 90% of your current emotional reality, it shrinks almost instantaneously to 0.0001% of your overall lifespan as soon as you put a year or two between you and the event.
It's the psychological equivalent of being pressed right up against the canvas of a massive painting.
Yes, that's it.
All you can see are the frantic brushstrokes, the chaotic texture, the immediate overwhelming color. You can't discern the overall image or the scale.
You need distance to see the composition.
You need distance to see the structure and the relative size of that little hill compared to the entire mountain range of your life's journey.
And we are so easily convinced in the moment that the current obstacle is, in fact, the largest obstacle we will ever face.
Always.
That immediate proximity creates an illusion of a singular, unique scale. But the observation shows that most things that feel urgent are only urgent within a very small, defined window of time.
And once you're outside that window,
they revert to being neutral, or just an insignificant memory.
But I wonder, and this is just an observation, if that truth doesn't lead to a complex internal debate. If the urgency always fades, regardless of the outcome, doesn't that inherently reduce the motivation to act responsibly in the moment? It almost sounds like time validates procrastination.
That is a critical observation, but we have to maintain our non-advice tone here. We're just observing, not judging the action.
Right.
The observation suggests that time dissolves the feeling of pressure, not necessarily the consequences of the action. Okay. That's the distinction.
Yes. Regardless of the outcome, whether you successfully met the deadline or you catastrophically failed, the crushing sensation of urgency associated with that moment still dissipates.
Why?
Precisely because the temporal window closed. Time is a neutral solvent for the feeling itself. It doesn't care if you succeeded or failed, it simply removes the immediacy that fueled the panic.
So that's the core mechanism then. Distance is a natural filter. It's not an active mental decision to discard something or some forceful act of letting go that requires a ton of conscious effort.
No, it's a passive, almost thermodynamic process. Time simply removes the heat, that immediacy, that powers a sense of urgency.
Right.
You don't decide to stop worrying about the email you forgot to send 5 years ago. Time simply renders that worry impossible to sustain because the environment that supported the worry no longer exists.
The memory might there.
The memory might exist, sure, but the emotional charge has dissipated to zero. What's truly fascinating is reflecting on how many seemingly catastrophic pressures that you might be feeling today. How many of those will likely not even register as a conscious memory a year from now?
We confuse the intensity of the moment with its permanence.
We do. We project the current emotional weight infinitely forward.
We assume that the problem that feels enormous today will feel equally enormous tomorrow and next month and next year. But if you actually look back at your own emotional landscape, the majority of the things that consumed your mental focus 6 months ago are now simply gone.
Gone, not solved, just gone.
Exactly. This is a pattern of spontaneous forgetting, not always of active, conscious resolution. Time just filters out the noise naturally without requiring our permission or our effort.
And if we extrapolate on that filtering function, it implies that the most demanding, emotionally exhausting moments are also paradoxically the most ephemeral.
How so?
Well, because their power source immediacy is the most fleeting variable in the whole equation of experience.
That's a powerful way to put it. The observation suggests that if you are currently submerged in a perceived crisis of urgency, the one certain thing about that crisis is that the immediate consuming feeling will dissolve.
Even if the underlying facts remain.
Even if the facts remain. It's the sensation, the panic, the must-do-now feeling that time aggressively targets and dissolves first.
So the facts get dealt with in the long term, but the heat of the moment just can't survive the temporal distance.
It can't. So The gift of distance isn't really clarity on the problem itself. It's the neutralization of the emotion that's tied to the problem.
And that scale shift is what turns an existential threat into, what, an interesting historical anecdote about yourself.
Exactly. Time gives us permission to move on simply by making the now disappear and replacing it with the then.
Okay, building on that concept of temporal distance, let's shift our observation to effort.
Right. Because while urgency is observed to dissolve, effort operates very differently. It often feels chaotic, misdirected, or even, I don't know, meaningless in the middle of it, only for its value to be assigned much, much later by the cumulative effect of time.
This resonates so strongly with the experience of what you could call the chaotic middle. We've all had those periods of intense energy expenditure in the past that just felt messy, misdirected, or even completely wasted while we were in the thick of it.
Absolutely. You're learning a difficult skill that feels totally unnecessary, or you're working on a project that you end up shelving.
Or pursuing a major goal that ultimately just fails or shifts so dramatically it's unrecognizable.
And in the moment of that struggle, the return on investment seems negative or zero. You put in 500 hours learning a specific coding language or a complex piece of equipment.
Right.
And the immediate goal, the job application or the prototype, it fails. That felt incredibly effortful, but also frustratingly fruitless.
But then years later, we look back and we realize this unseen scaffolding phenomenon was at work the whole time.
Unseen scaffolding, I like that.
Our current stability or expertise or even a specific personality trait often relies on this long string of past efforts that seemed totally unrelated or fruitless individually.
So you weren't building the project you thought you were building.
Exactly. You were building the fundamental tools, the resilience, the discipline, the ability to synthesize knowledge.
Right.
The things that enabled the next successful project, which you couldn't have even conceived of back then.
So the effort itself was just the labor, completely detached from its future context. The tools you mentioned, the discipline required to sit through 500 hours of debugging, for instance, the tolerance for frustration, the mastery of a specific workflow, just learning how to structure a complex problem. These are the psychological and technical deposits that get made when the original visible goal was missed.
So the value was infrastructural, not immediate.
Precisely.
I think about recalling a major intellectual struggle. Let's say grappling with a particularly difficult theoretical concept in, I don't know, economics or advanced math. And the immediate objective was just to pass a specific graduate exam. And maybe you barely achieved that, or maybe you even missed it entirely.
Right. So in the moment, it feels like a failure.
A total failure.
Yeah.
But the fundamental way of thinking that you developed, the ability to tolerate ambiguity, or just the sheer resilience you gained from grappling with that complexity for months on end, that proved absolutely invaluable later.
In a completely different context.
In a completely different professional context.
Yeah.
Like a high-stakes negotiation or organizational design, something totally unrelated.
So that past self, the one wrestling with the theoretical concept, had no idea they were preparing the current self for a completely different career scenario years down the line.
No idea at all. The meaning wasn't available in the struggle itself.
The meaning only became apparent when the resulting skill was required and performed successfully years later. And that allowed the current self to connect the dots backward.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, it seems like meaning and purpose are frequently assigned backward. The effort was just the doing, the raw expenditure of time and energy.
And the meaning is the interpretation of those results, but through the lens of accumulated experience. It's what a sociologist or a psychologist might call narrative smoothing.
Narrative smoothing.
Yeah, it's the way we retrospectively organize all these messy data points into a cohesive, useful story about ourselves.
So the current self looks back at the past self and kind of performs this editorial function.
Exactly. It assigns significance to the struggle based on what that struggle ultimately facilitated. The struggling past self didn't have that luxury or that perspective.
They only had the immediate, frustrating challenge and the perceived low return on investment.
Which brings up a fascinating point, the difference between perceived value in the moment and actual value years later.
Right. Sometimes the effort that felt intensely necessary, that big publicized push for a visible external goal, it can retrospectively appear trivial because this specific, celebrated outcome ultimately didn't matter to the overall trajectory of your life. It was, in hindsight, a distraction.
And conversely, effort that felt trivial. Maybe the hour you spent tinkering with an obscure hobby.
Or reading some esoteric philosophical text.
Right. that may retrospectively appear absolutely essential because it sparked the genuine, enduring interest. Or it provided the one unique insight that unlocked a major later success or a structural life change.
So the quiet, persistent efforts often become the cornerstone of later meaning.
That's the paradox, isn't it? True meaning often requires separation from the effort itself. When you're exerting the energy, your focus is necessarily on the pain, the immediate objective, the potential failure.
You're too close to the process.
Way too close. The enduring value is not in the struggle itself, but in what the struggle enabled. And that only becomes clear when the current self is far removed and has the capacity to actually use those bank skills.
So the struggle itself is it just neutral in terms of meaning?
I think so, yes. Meaning is subjective and it's relational. It's what that past effort relates to in the present context that defines its value.
So until that relationship is formed, until the skill is needed, or the resilience is tested,
the effort remains just that, undifferentiated, seemingly wasteful effort.
This leads into a deeper discussion about something we could call unforced preparation. We often structure our lives around intentional preparation, right? Studying for a known exam, training for a known race, building a required portfolio.
All very deliberate.
But maybe the most valuable preparation is often unforced, created accidentally by the detours.
Unforced preparation. So that would be the effort expended when the purpose is entirely unclear, or maybe the goal eventually fails.
Right. And that effort, even when it was aimed at a goal that ultimately shifts or collapses, it's never truly lost.
It's simply deposited into a different account.
Exactly. Not the goal account, but the experience, endurance, and skill mastery accounts. Deposits that time, validates later when a new opportunity presents itself.
It's the sheer, sustained exposure to difficulty that builds the muscle of competence. Even if you completely discard the subject matter, say, you never code in that obscure language again. The experience of having overcome the urge to quit is banked. That psychological ability to sustain focus or tolerate sustained ambiguity, that's what time rewards, even if the initial context was entirely arbitrary.
So the long view observes that the current self is just an accumulation of every messy, misdirected, and successful effort.
And the efforts that felt fruitless are simply awaiting a future context to assign them relevance. Time is the curator, linking all these disparate actions into a cohesive narrative of development.
We are quite literally standing on a foundation built by the countless mistakes and discarded attempts of the previous version of ourselves.
And that previous version of you, the one doing the hard work, they didn't need to know the why. They didn't need to have the validation.
They just needed to keep doing the work.
Yes. That requirement of effort without immediate, obvious validation is a hallmark of truly valuable long-term preparation. If the meaning were immediately obvious, the effort might not have been challenging enough to create that valuable structural scaffolding we rely on later.
Which leads to a quiet, pretty profound realization.
What's that?
The very lack of clarity, the feeling of confusion or wastefulness in the moment, that might actually be the necessary ingredient for the effort to become truly transformative later.
So it's the efforts we pursued despite the lack of immediate visible reward that often prove to be the most critical in retrospect.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've observed how temporal distance neutralizes urgency and how this retrospective gaze assigns meaning to past effort.
Right.
The final observation is perhaps the most quiet and profound. It's how our core priorities naturally shift over years rather than through these intentional, forceful decisions made over days.
Time acts as a passive, almost geological filter for what we truly value.
Which raises an important question for observation. How much of our priority shifting is actually conscious, and how much is merely the natural effect of prolonged time?
Because we tend to view prioritization as this active, daily decision, right? A checklist item we have to execute.
Right. But when you look back a decade, the shift is often structural, not tactical.
The daily activity.
Yeah.
That's what we might call triage.
Triage.
We actively decide what fire to put out first, what meeting to attend, which bill to pay. That's active situational prioritization.
But the decade-long drift, moving from valuing, say, aggressive career ascent above all else, to valuing deep familial connection.
Or maybe valuing the quiet mastery of a niche craft.
That fundamental structural change didn't happen because you wrote a new list on a whiteboard one morning.
No.
That structural change is the passive filtering function of time. It's not about waking up and deciding to forcefully care less about X and more about Y.
It's much subtler.
It's the quiet atrophy of interest in X and the persistent, unforced growth of interest in Y due to sustained exposure and resonance with one's deeper self over a period of years.
It's the difference between a high-stakes, short-term distraction, let's call it X, that requires constant aggressive maintenance to keep alive, and a low-stakes, long-term resonant pursuit Y that just maintains itself quietly over time.
And time starves the distraction of attention and feeds the persistent resonance through mere presence.
Yeah. Consider the things that occupied our collective attention 5 years ago. The viral outrage of the week.
The hot new technology that promised to revolutionize everything.
The specific political personality dominating the news cycle. Those were urgent priorities then. They demanded daily mental energy and emotional investment.
And now, most of them are footnotes, passively filtered out by the sheer lack of sustained resonance outside of their immediate temporal context.
So what survives the attrition of years? I think that's the ultimate test of a true long-term priority. The things we spend the most time discussing or worrying about in the present often just vanish, while the quiet, persistent, less publicized priorities,
Like what?
like nurturing deeply felt relationships, or engaging in deep learning that has no immediate market value, or pursuing specific non-commercial creative pursuits. Those are the ones that consistently survive the passing of the years.
So we observe that current priorities are often temporary and situationally dependent.
Yeah, they're necessary for navigating the immediate environment and its demands.
But true, long-term priorities are recognized by their persistence despite neglect.
That's a great way to put it. Persistence despite neglect.
They are the interests you return to automatically after a busy, demanding season. The connections that remain strong even with minimal effort because the underlying value is genuinely resonant, not reactive.
So the long view reveals that the loud, visible priorities are frequently transient,
They're responding to external validation, social pressure, immediate crisis.
while the quiet priorities, conversely, are responding to internal resonance and deep curiosity, the things that maintain their pull even when no one is watching.
And time inherently favors the internally resonant over the externally demanded.
Why do you think that is?
Because only resonance provides the sustained fuel necessary to survive years of attrition. External pressure runs out, internal resonance doesn't.
We can observe a phenomenon where a project or even a perceived identity that once seemed so central to one's existence, let's say a specific high-powered career path or a certain social status, is quietly moved to the periphery by time, and it's replaced by something entirely unanticipated, maybe even something you actively resisted or dismissed years prior.
And the shift wasn't a fierce, conscious battle of will.
Not at all. It was a slow, imperceptible, geological movement of the internal landscape.
So the realization doesn't arrive through some dramatic, decisive moment to quit or change direction.
No, it arrives through what we could call the quiet conclusion of disinterest. You just stop noticing that you aren't doing the thing anymore. You look up one day and realize the project or the path is gone. Not because you destroyed it.
But because you simply failed to maintain it over a long enough period.
Exactly.
And analyzing that feeling, when a former priority simply ceases to matter, not through rejection or failure or some grand declaration of change, but through a gentle temporal fading, that's key.
Yeah.
You didn't fight the attachment. Time simply wore away the need for it. This phenomenon is a key part of the long view. Time handles the discarding process so efficiently and so passively that sometimes you only realize something was discarded when you look for it years later and find it's just not there.
And it's been replaced by something far more resonant.
Exactly.
And so what's left, what remains, are the things that had enough inherent gravitational pull, enough internal resonance to survive the lack of urgent daily attention.
The things that endure without requiring that aggressive, immediate maintenance we spend so much of our energy on.
This perspective encourages us to observe our priorities not in these fixed, immovable targets we have to actively manage,
Right.
but as fluctuating states that the temporal environment is constantly shaping and pruning.
We don't have to force the change. We just need to observe the persistent direction of the quiet drift over prolonged periods to understand what is truly enduring.
It's a humbling observation, really, because it suggests that much of our intense day-to-day effort to aggressively manage priorities is simply managing the noise of the moment. While the true structural, identity-defining changes in our lives are happening quietly in the background, dictated by the relentless forces of persistence and internal resonance over years.
And that quiet conclusion of disinterest. It's the most elegant insight time offers us in this domain. It shows us that If something truly is not meant to be a long-term priority,
Yeah.
the effort required to keep caring about it eventually exceeds the energy required to simply allow time to let it fade. And eventually, time handles the subtraction automatically.
So we've spent this time observing how temporal distance neutralizes the heat of urgency, how the retrospective gaze assigns necessary meaning to chaotic past effort.
And how quiet persistence dictates the true structural shifts in what we ultimately value.
It's a calm return to the central theme, isn't it? The staggering and non-judgmental power of temporal scale.
It is. Just a few years can completely overhaul a landscape of emotional concerns and physical efforts without any conscious intervention or motivational push from us.
Time is the most powerful and objective filter we possess.
It is. And we tend to confuse the scale of the now with the scale of the then.
That intense magnification, the emotional heat of the immediate moment, it fundamentally obscures the fact that the moment is, by definition, the most fleeting element of any human experience.
So, as a final observation for you to contemplate, reflect on the possibility that the feeling of urgency itself might be the single most temporary, high-frequency, and ultimately disposable aspect of any experience you currently face. How often, in the crush of the present, do we confuse the fleeting feeling of now, which is chemically designed to overwhelm us, with the enduring reality of then?